Most children today carry their whole world in their pocket, glowing and humming away. But in the early 1960s, British children carried something very different, something far quieter, and it quietly shaped who they became. You can almost feel it now, that small weight resting in a coat pocket, the gentle clink or rustle as you walked, the comfort of knowing it was there because you'd chosen it carefully. Picture a weekday morning on a narrow street, front doors open one by one, school shoes wait on the step, slightly scuffed, still damp from yesterday's walk home. A mother calls from the doorway, a father checks the time, and off you go, pockets checked, bags slung over a shoulder. Those ordinary objects you carried weren't just things. They mattered. They had a job to do, and somehow, so did you. Back then, childhood wasn't filled with endless choice. Most children owned only one or two treasured items, used every day, mended when broken, and rarely replaced. They weren't toys or clever gadgets. They were companions, quietly teaching patience, responsibility, and imagination without anyone ever saying a word. Many of these everyday items have vanished now, or changed so much they're barely recognizable. Yet their influence lingers in surprising ways. Here on Past Britannia, we try to remember the little things, the ones history books never mention. If this already feels familiar, do take a moment to subscribe, and perhaps give it a like, so these memories don't disappear for us. Britain in the early to mid-1960s moved to a quieter rhythm than we remember today. Homes were smaller, cupboards less crowded, but daily routines felt fuller somehow. Mornings followed familiar patterns, afternoons stretched out, and evenings settled gently around the kitchen table. Streets belonged to everyone. Neighbors knew each other, doors were left open, and children drifted in and out of sight, trusted to return when they were hungry or tired. For children, life was shaped by limitation, though it rarely felt like a lack. There simply wasn't much to choose from, so imagination did the heavy lifting. You made the most of what you had, because what you had was all there was. Ownership mattered. A single object might be used every day, carried everywhere, and quietly treasured. When something wore out, it wasn't replaced without thought. It was fixed, shared, handed down, or adapted into something new. These habits crept in without instruction. No one sat children down to explain thrift or care. They learned by watching adults mend, save, and reuse, and by copying what they saw at home and in the street. Lessons arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary life. Most children didn't realize they were being shaped by this way of living. Freedom came with responsibility, even at a young age. You were expected to look after your things, remember them, not lose them. Adults trusted children more then, not because times were easier, but because children were woven into daily life differently. Independence wasn't announced, it was assumed. Today, childhood looks very different. There is abundance everywhere, choices piled on top of choices. Objects come and go, replaced without much pause. Back then, one simple thing could be used 100 different ways, remembered for decades afterwards. Now, many things pass through childhood without leaving a mark. And it's often the least exciting objects that stay with us the longest. The first few everyday items we'll talk about didn't seem special at the time. Almost every British child had one, even if they never stopped to think about it at all back then. Some of the most powerful memories from 1960s childhood aren't tied to big events at all, but two small objects that lived quietly in pockets, drawers, and school bags. Things you barely noticed at the time, yet reached for every single day. You remember the feel of them before the look, the familiar weight, the sound they made when you walked. There were things kept in coat pockets, smoothed by fingers while waiting, rubbed absent-mindedly on the way to school or home. Things shared between brothers and sisters, argued over briefly, then passed along without ceremony. Objects that taught patience simply by existing, because they couldn't be rushed, replaced, or ignored. If you lost one, you felt it immediately, like something was missing from the day itself. Other items belonged outdoors. They encouraged movement, exploration, and invention. Pavements became racetracks, gardens turned into worlds, and quiet corners were transformed through sheer imagination. You didn't need instructions. You worked it out as you went along, adapting games, changing rules, making something new from the same familiar object again and again. What mattered wasn't how exciting these things were, but how present they felt. They had texture. Some were cold in winter, warm from your hand in summer. Some made a soft click, a dull scrape, a gentle rattle. These sounds became part of the background of childhood, as normal as footsteps or distant voices calling you in for tea. Parents rarely explained why these objects mattered. They didn't need to. Children learned through repetition and routine. You took responsibility without realizing it, caring for something because it was yours, because there wasn't another waiting to take its place. If it broke, you coped. If it wore out, you adapted. Today, many childhood objects are replaced almost as quickly as they're unwrapped. Waiting has become unfamiliar. Back then, waiting was part of the experience. It taught patience, creativity, and resilience in ways no lesson ever could. They sat quietly in the background of daily life, rarely celebrated, almost invisible until years later. Looking back now, it's surprising how much meaning gathered around such modest things. They shaped habits, expectations, and small decisions without ever asking for attention. And just when childhood seemed built entirely from play and routine, another set of ordinary items began doing something else entirely. They didn't simply pass the time, they introduced rules, consequences, and understanding, gently preparing children for the wider world waiting beyond the front door. Those changes arrived quietly, but they stayed with us for life always. By the time children reached a certain age, some everyday objects began carrying quieter lessons. They were no longer just for play or passing the time. They taught responsibility, awareness, and a sense that the world worked two patterns you had to learn. Time was no longer abstract. You learned it through routine, through waiting, through knowing when to be somewhere and why it mattered. Money, too, arrived not as numbers, but as something physical. It was counted carefully, held tightly, and understood through use. Spending meant choosing, saving meant patience. Care mattered because loss was felt. Independence grew in these small moments, guided more by experience than instruction. Many of these items encouraged children to interact with one another. They were shared, borrowed, compared, and talked about. Children gathered around them, traded stories, made small rules, and learned how to get along. Across streets and neighborhoods, the same objects appeared again and again. Class mattered less than routine. Whether you lived in a terrace, a semi, or a flat, there was a shared understanding of how these things fitted into daily life. Of course, there were regional differences. Accents changed, habits shifted slightly, but the foundations felt familiar everywhere. A child visiting cousins in another town might notice small variations, yet still recognize the objects waiting on the table or tucked away in a drawer. They formed a quiet national language of childhood. What's rarely talked about is how children adapted when something broke or went missing. There was no immediate replacement. Imagination filled the gap. Games were altered. New uses were invented. Boredom wasn't feared or avoided. It was accepted as part of the day, often becoming the starting point for creativity. In those moments, growing up happened quietly. You learned to judge time by light fading, to measure worth by effort, and to care because care was expected. Responsibility wasn't announced. It settled in slowly, through trust given and trust kept. These lessons stayed long after the objects themselves disappeared, shaping how people worked, saved, and treated others. Modern childhood looks very different. Experiences are more personalized now, shaped by individual tastes rather than shared habits. Fewer moments exist where everyone remembers the same thing in the same way. Childhood feels more private now, less communal, with fewer shared reference points to hold onto together. Yet when you step back, you realize it wasn't the objects themselves people miss, it was what they gave children. And that understanding gently prepares us for what comes next. It explains why these memories still matter, and why the next part feels so familiar. Because we lived it, even if we never noticed until years later when we looked back quietly. Most people have forgotten this, but childhood once unfolded at a gentler pace, and somehow felt fuller for it. Days weren't crammed with plans or distractions. Time stretched, routines repeated, and meaning settled into small moments. Children felt trusted then, trusted to walk, wait, remember, and return. That trust shaped confidence in quiet, lasting ways. Everyday things played a larger role than we realized. A simple object could encourage patience, care, and resilience without any lesson ever being spoken aloud. You learned to look after what you owned because it mattered. You learned to cope when it failed you. This small thing quietly shaped British childhood forever, not through excitement, but through repetition and responsibility. Many viewers watching now may recognize something else. Those habits didn't disappear. They traveled forward in time. They shaped how people later raised their own children, how they valued repair over replacement, how they passed down stories instead of instructions. Values were handed on quietly, not announced, absorbed through example rather than words. It's worth pausing here, just for a moment. Picture one ordinary item from your childhood. Feel its weight again. Hear the sound it made. Remember where you kept it and why it mattered. Notice how easily the memory returns when you allow the silence to do the work. Life felt slower then, but it asked something of you. It gave freedom, but expected care in return. It allowed boredom, and rewarded imagination. These everyday things didn't make childhood perfect, but they made it grounding, and they left people better prepared for what came next. So what happened when all this slowly disappeared? And why does remembering it now still stir something deep, reminding us that ordinary moments once carried extraordinary weight, shaping lives long after childhood itself had quietly moved on, away? Then and now don't need to be enemies. Modern childhood has gained comfort, safety, and opportunity, and there's no denying the world has opened up in remarkable ways. Children today can explore more, learn faster, and stay connected across distance. That progress matters, and it deserves its place. Yet something quietly slipped away along the journey. Not excitement or fun, but the weight of ordinary moments. Back then, everyday things didn't make childhood perfect. They made it meaningful. They taught patience because waiting was unavoidable. They encouraged imagination because boredom existed. They built independence because trust was given early and often. What we remember now isn't a list of objects, but the feeling they created. a sense of belonging to a shared childhood, shaped by routine, care, and small responsibilities. Those lessons stayed with people long after the objects themselves disappeared. As we reach the end, it's worth asking yourself, do you remember any of these? Or was there something we've missed that meant just as much to you? Share your memories below. And if this brought someone to mind, share this with someone who grew up in 1960s Britain. They'll remember more than they expect. Thanks for remembering together.